and welcome to Proforum 2020. It is my pleasure to introduce today's host, Dominique Milton, President and CEO of CVMSDC, and Andrea Horn, Supplier Diversity Manager of SAS Institute.
Well, first, CVMSDC Virtual Conference, Using Technology for Velocity, the evolution of artificial intelligence within procurement. I am so excited to be here with each of you today. A special thanks to our host and title sponsor, SAS. Leading the church at SAS is Andrea Horn. Andrea, it is a pleasure planning this conference with you. We started planning 1 year ago. We could not have even imagined a completely virtual event. Thanks to you and your entire planning team for aligning a powerful cross-industry group of experts on artificial intelligence.
Dominique, you are right about that. I never imagined we would be doing this virtually. A huge thank you to you and everyone on the CVMSDC team and everyone on our planning committee. I would also like to thank our Executive Vice President and Chief Corporate Services Officer, Trish Dowdy, and my Director of Procurement, Steve Holt. Without their continued support for SAS's work in supplier diversity, I would not have been able to do this. I've loved the collaboration of everyone working together. It has made this transition from an in-person to virtual event as seamless as could be expected. I've definitely learned so much and enjoyed the process.
Along with this being our first virtual conference, Andrea, we wanted to create content that is relevant to any company. Every supply chain and procurement professional can utilize the best practices shared here today to make improvements. In turn, with a general understanding, we can each look at how supplier diversity is impacted by this current information.
And I think it's fantastic that we open this event up so that anyone could register. It's important for small and diverse companies to see the challenges that procurement and finance professionals go through, whether that be procurement fraud or the difficulties in verifying supplier data. We are going to hear beneficial solutions from our panelists and keynote on how AI can be part of the solution to these problems.
Andrea, as always, you know me. When we have an event, I like to share the mission of CVMSDC with our audience so that everyone can understand the importance of our work. CVMSDC is one of 23 affiliate councils across the United States, and we cover North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia. NMSDC, the parent organization, is out of New York and is 47 years old. Our mission, as you can see on the screen, is to expand business opportunities for minority business enterprises, we call them MBEs, and create mutually beneficial links between corporate partners and MBEs. The ultimate outcome is to add economic value to the supply chain while increasing economic opportunities in the business community. And we accomplish this mission with 4 pillars of work. The first pillar is certification. We are the largest certifying agency in the United States for ethnic minority business owners. Development. We create developmental programs for our corporate partners, like this conference, and for our business owners so that they can utilize current information and realize continuous improvement. Connections. We host multiple events each year that allow our corporate partners and MBEs to interact with each other, and that includes matchmaking opportunities. And then finally, advocacy. With over 12,000 members, we can advocate on the national, regional, and local levels to make sure that laws are favorable and programs are developed to help build economic wealth, break down injustices, and create equal playing fields. Currently, we have several campaigns through NMSDC to address racial equity nationwide. You will hear more about our campaigns at the end of this conference from our national president, Adrian Trimble. With trillions of dollars in sales annually, minority businesses make a huge impact on our economy. For our participants today, learning how you can improve your supply chain with AI also requires attention to how you can improve the diversity of your supply chain.
Absolutely. Minority businesses have a huge impact on our economy, and during this time, they need our support. There are ways to help. NMSDC and the 23 regional councils have made it easy for us to help in actionable ways through the 2020 MBE Recovery and Revitalization Campaign. We are in this together. Corporate members are invited to recommit to the utilization and growth of minority businesses. There are several ways we can do this. Go to nmsdc.org to learn more about the Rebuilding Fund, the Minority Business Advocacy Initiative, the NMSDC Business Consortium Fund, and the NMSDC Academy. You can start today by having your organization make a pledge to support these programs and support MBE economic inclusion. I am happy to say that SAS has made that pledge. At SAS, we are also taking other immediate actions around racism and unconscious bias. One of those actions being starting discussions with others in our industry around the ethical use of technology. We believe it's important to continue our work to improve technology. By understanding how discrimination and bias enter algorithmic decision-making and how to eliminate them. At the conclusion of this event, we will share a message from NMSDC President Adrian Trimble. I urge you all to take a closer, solution-oriented approach at what you and your organizations can do moving forward. All minority businesses matter. Now it's time to say a huge thank you to our Proforum sponsors. SAS, Reynolds American, ISM, JTech, and Lenovo.
Thank you, Andrea, for your commitment in making the pledge to NMSDC. I want to recognize also our volunteer board led by Jeff Conley of Henrico County, all of our corporate partners, and our annual corporate sponsors. I will read each name because we have some participants that are joining us by phone, and I want to make sure that everyone is recognized. So, Sunoco, Capital One, Bank of America, Enterprise, Ferguson, BMW, Dominion Energy, Duke Energy, Lowe's, Denny's, Cox, Virginia Beach Economic Development, Michelin, Volvo, Retail Business Services, formerly known as Food Lion, Altria, Fluor, Atrium Health, Savannah River Nuclear Site, TIAA, and SAS. Because of each of you, we are able to grow wealth through realized opportunities, which accomplishes our mission. Now, for some housekeeping rules. Each of you should have 2 ways to communicate today. Feel free to use the chat box. Right now, you've been interacting through the chat box, but I want you to make sure that you can find the Q&A box on your screen. You may have to hit the 3 horizontal dots to find it, but the Q&A box is how we're going to interact with our panel. And if you drop your questions in there, when we go live and open up the Q&A, we will allow you to ask your questions live with our panel. So make sure you have the Q&A box handy. The chat box is just to communicate with each other. Also, you can change the view of your screen. You can go to a grid view or a speaker view, and that's at the top right-hand side of your screen. So with that, I ask you to sit back and enjoy this information. We have just a powerful panel lined up for you and a powerful keynote speaker after the panel and after our break. So for that, I will turn it over to you, Andrea, to introduce our moderator, Dupree Jones. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dominique. Dupree, it has been great working with you on this event. Before the panel gets started, let me tell our viewers a little about you. Dupree has an extensive procurement background that started over a decade ago at Delta Airlines in support of the merger of Delta and Northwest, delivering cost savings and innovations for logistics, airport operations, and aircraft cabin design. Dupree has also held category leadership roles at IBM, Accenture, and MetLife in sourcing, procurement transformation, and vendor management. He is currently at Toshiba Global Commerce Solutions, where he manages global logistics procurement and operations for their retail store systems division. Additionally, Dupree is the president of the ISM Carolinas, Virginia Triangle chapter. This chapter oversees professional development for supply management professionals in the Research Triangle area and has grown the organization by reinstituting many partnerships with industry thought leaders, universities, and trade organizations. He holds the distinction of the Certified Professional in Supply Management from ISM and a Six Sigma Green Belt. ISM Carolinas, Virginia Triangle Chapter has made it possible for attendees to earn 2 continuing education credits today. Dupree, thank you so much. I will turn it over to you and the panel to get started.
Well, thank you so much. I'm blushing a little bit, but hopefully I'm sitting far enough from the camera so that no one can see it. It's an honor to be able to work with CVMSDC and for many of the other sponsors and our rock star panelists we have this morning. You'll notice from their bios on the event website, and you'll hear from them today, that they bring a wide variety of expertise across many areas that we procurement practitioners spend our times working on day after day. At this point, I'd like to also thank everyone for providing us input in the pre-event survey to give us an idea of where you are and where you want to be and how we can help you get there. With that, I'm going to introduce some of our panelists today. If you guys can give us just a little bit, give us a chance to get to know you a little bit, and how you help your companies in the area of AI. Starting with that, I would like to introduce Brad Mierenfeld from Capital One.
Hey, morning everyone, and thanks Dupree. My name is Brad Mierenfeld, and I've been at Capital One for 20 years in a variety of different technology roles. In my current role, I run technology delivery for our procurement organization. So from a procurement perspective, what that really means is we're in the process of trying to reimagine a lot of the work that our folks do through new technology, things like machine learning and AI. So super excited for today and looking forward to the conversation.
Great, thanks. Next on the list, I have a special bias towards this company and towards this panelist. I've known him for quite a while, Matt Capadia from IBM.
Thanks, Dupree. Yeah, it's great seeing you again as well. So my name is Matt Capadia, as Dupree said. I work within IBM's global procurement group, really leading all of the technology and transformation initiatives for our business process outsourcing organization for all of our external procurement clients. So my team's role is really looking at all of the technology that IBM's built and proven for itself within the procurement space, and then figuring out how do we commercialize that and take it to market. I've been with IBM for about 6 years, all in and around the procurement technology space, and previous to that, with Biogen and with Pfizer in a similar capacity, doing master data management and procurement work.
Great, thanks, Matt. Next on the list, I want to bring in Gary Storr. You want to just give us a little. You've got a wide variety of experiences as well, and now helping us figure out ways to find trust in our supplier partnerships.
Yeah, thanks, Dupree. I'm really happy to be here today, and super excited to hear the panelists, and to get started. Again, as Dupree mentioned, my name is Gary Storr. I'm with an organization called Chainway. And we're bringing to market a solution called Trust Your Supplier, and as the name suggests, Trust Your Supplier is all about trust in the supply chain and in supply information management. And so, I've had various positions in IT and in supply chain and then personnel store, and so I understand all of the pain points that exist in supply chain and supply information management and relationships between buyers and suppliers and the introduction of third parties into those processes. And so, our role is to bring together to market the solution that can help address some of those pain points. So, super excited again. Be part of this and look forward to the rest of the day.
Great, thanks, Gary. Next, I'd like to introduce another member of our local area here in the Raleigh-Durham area, Raj Kamra. He comes from Cisco Systems. And again, you bring also a very unique way of looking at procurement and applications in AI. Can you share a little bit about that?
Sure. Thanks, Dupree. Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Raj Kamra. I'm a data science leader at Cisco Systems, and part of my focus here is to explore new ways in which how we can harness data that hasn't been tapped yet, and explore and how we can deliver value to our stakeholders, right? So we use a lot of technologies. We use blockchain, AI, machine learning to figure out how we can deliver more deeper insights and meaningful insights to our stakeholders.
Great. Thank you so much. It's great to have you here. And I think this gentleman gets the award for the most miles traveled virtually to attend our conference today. Chris McCauley is with the SAS Institute and can help us understand a little bit more about the different elements of risk when it comes to procurement. Thanks, Chris, for joining.
You're welcome, Dupree. Thank you very much for hosting this session. Yes, my name is Chris McCauley. I'm a director at SAS, and I take care of the procure-to-pay solutions that we offer our clients. My particular area of interest is identifying fraud, waste, abuse, and irregular spending activities. We've been doing this for a number of years now, and tonight I'm in Abu Dhabi. I've worked in very many countries, most of the major economies and a lot of the emerging markets in my time. And we've been able to use our experiences gained in the field to help provide solutions to our client base globally to identify the challenges that are present in these areas. Okay.
Great. Thanks so much for being here. Let's dig right into some of the observations we were able to glean from the survey. First question here comes, and I'd like to first pick on Gary and Brad. It comes to mind when you hear about artificial intelligence. Most of our survey participants said that they understand it to be machine learning software applications that can learn as they go. So I'm excited to hear about that. The next in that ranking was that AI really equals data analytics. And humorously enough, 14% said it's all about science fiction. It's what you see in science fiction movies. So I had to giggle at that. Brad, what do you glean from that about when they hear artificial intelligence, their perceptions?
Yeah, I love the science fiction question, Dupree, because I know in my role, the things we're trying to push forward, often kind of people look at me like I have three heads. So I appreciate that folks having that perspective, because there's definitely some of that thought out there, and hopefully we'll kind of dispel and demystify some of that today. So the way I look at it as, from a Capital One perspective, we're all about leveraging data for information to drive action. And so most folks have likely seen kind of the Capital One commercials talk about the Capital One Assistant. So often from a procurement perspective, I think we largely use technology to kind of document things that are done sort of after the fact. So how do we kind of change that game? How do we flip that on its side and start to leverage technology to start to drive action through innovation? We've got a bunch of data and a bunch of information. Let's start to use it. So when I hear some of those questions, it's a matter of like, how do we get started? Starting small. You hear a lot of us talk today about starting small. Don't try to boil the ocean. Try to make sure we show value over time. But you'll also hear a lot about data. It's how you leverage that data in a much smarter way going forward.
Great. So Gary, I'm going to actually pick on you for another question, if that's okay. We asked those attendees to help us understand how do companies actually make use of analytics and AI. Most of them actually said they look at it for financial forecasting and planning. Others looked at it for contract lifecycle management, but only 11% looked at it for regulatory compliance or data privacy. What could you glean from that? How does that relate back to your world?
Well, I'll go back to what Brad mentioned a minute ago. It's really all about information, isn't it? And about and analytics is just about the depth of information. We know the data is rapidly becoming the most significant resource that we have in the world. And so what we're living through today, right? All this uncertainty of the world with the pandemic and other issues, I think it just raises awareness around how data is going to help us, not just from a regulatory compliance perspective and a data privacy perspective, but really we're talking about, what is the bubble of trust look like? trust. Data privacy is all about trust and the underlying security around them. And we're going to need to change our view and our definition of those terms as we move forward, because we've seen over the last few months that what we thought was our normal has now changed. And analytics is going to give us a greater ability by using the data available to make some better decisions. We've all seen a lot of misinformation on the breastwork and the news over the course of the last several months. Now what we need to do is be data-based. We need to be data, like every truly mature organization, we need to be data-driven. So we need to start to acquire the data, and we need to perform that data analytics function, whether it's using AI, machine learning, or big data techniques, or whatever it might be, or whatever underlying technology we're leveraging. But it's really going to be all about the data and how the data drives us to those key areas of trust, to drive compliance, to drive privacy, to drive security, to alleviate all the concerns we have, to be prescriptive and predictive around what's coming next instead of reactive like we've been over the course of the last several months.
Hi, Gary. So sorry, this is Shelby. We're having a little bit of difficulty hearing you. If you could please use a headset if possible for the remainder of the session, that would be great. Thank you.
So within that, I'm going to just maybe provide a few takeaways from Gary's, actually, from my opinion, pretty insightful comment. Data is not just a commodity. It's very precious and valuable to those who share it and those who keep it and those who receive it. And with that comes an element of trust. Now, globally, you're seeing regulations out there about the treatment of data. When you provide data to someone, how you protect it, how you ensure trust, not only as a procurement professional, but from suppliers as well as, even those who provided their answers to the surveys. So it's not just about trust, it's about security, it's about a lot of things. And compliance is one way that we can enforce and equip that trusting relationship. And thank you, Gary, for some of those highlights. So next, I'd like to maybe talk to some of the other panelists about how is AI what's the definition of AI within your company? And Matt, I'm going to pick on you for a little bit if I can, because IBM's got this big definition of Watson. Watson takes all this data, even from the Weather Channel, or now with the merger with Red Hat. Data and AI take on a very different view. So Matt, what does AI mean for IBM?
Yeah, and I think it all foundationally comes back to data, like we were talking about previously. I think if you asked our Chief Procurement Officer, Bob Murphy at IBM, what the most valuable commodity is to a procurement practitioner, the answer would be data. So if you look at some of the acquisitions that IBM's made over time, things like the weather company, a lot of that is because they had the largest data store of weather data on the planet. And we can use a lot of that for predictive models around supply chain assurance and other use cases like that. When I look at AI, how we've used it across procurement, I think we've really looked at what are the tasks that bog down our procurement practitioners and how can you ultimately use intelligent technology to make their lives easier and have them focus on higher value add activity. So certainly in analytics, I think we have sourcing practitioners that spend a lot of time combing through data and trying to find market intelligence. But if you can use AI to do that for you essentially and start to pull where there could be actionable opportunities out of your data, query your data for you, and ultimately pull in a lot of external data sources that it would just be far too time consuming to go out as a human and try to grab yourself. That are very powerful use cases where AI is aided. And then also in things like contracts, if you think about use cases like mergers and acquisitions, for a procurement group, going through an acquired company's contracts used to take years. Now with the emergence of some of these AI technologies that actually have natural language understanding, they can go through those contracts in very short periods of time and just pull out where the highest risk or highest exposure sits. And that's ultimately aided in a lot of efficiency gains for a procurement group.
Great. Well, you couldn't have provided a better segue into Raj into his world, I think. Raj, that seems to be a lot of what you focus on at Cisco is in contracts and contract lifecycle management. You could maybe give us an example. Can you provide us an example of how that has proven effective and valuable to Cisco?
Yeah, sure. So within procurement, I mean, contracts obviously is a big part of procurement, and we have thousands of contracts, obviously, with all our suppliers. And a lot of that information, a lot of that value is logged within those PDF documents or Word documents, and they are actually, something that we have not had a chance to harness before, right? I mean, we obviously had data in our CLM cycle. We had the structured data in terms of the contract start date, end date, and so on and so forth. But then how do you go deeper into the contract, the unstructured data, the language of the contracts, and be able to compare and contrast, right? How consistently are you using your terms and clauses, right? So that is one of the big things within Cisco that we did, is that we have a standard set of contract language, and then we have thousands of contracts, and then we can, in just less than a minute, we can compare and contrast how we are using a particular clause, whether it's indemnity or whether it's limitation of liability, etc. How is that language consistently or inconsistently used, where the differences are, and how deep those differences are. So you can actually very easily quantify those differences, and then you can take action on what you want to do with those things then, right? So that is a classic example of how we can drive compliance within our contract structures. And also, to Matt's point, Cisco is a big company, and we do tons of mergers and acquisitions all the time. And how do we onboard those contracts? How do we onboard those suppliers? How do we ensure that the risk profile that these contracts bring in is less than the risk profile that we already have within the contracts that we have with these companies? So it's a lot of value that AI and machine learning, and specifically the natural language processing algorithms, provide in the space. So it's just getting started.
Great. Actually, you're helpful. You get a gold star too for providing a good segue to Chris's work. Data, and with Gary. So Chris, data, we heard data is not just a commodity, but a really valuable resource. And each of us has data, and sometimes we really don't want everybody having our data. But at the same time, is that data reliable? Is that data trustworthy? And from what you and I have talked about before the conference, that's really a big part of what you were trying to do there at SAS in identifying potential fraudulent data.
Yes, that's right. One of the challenges that we always face when we go to is to be able to make best use of the enterprise data that they provide to us. Now, I and my colleagues work in a very niche area. So what we're trying to do is examine historical enterprise data for the purposes of finding suspicious activity. That activity may be related to some form of abuse within the procure-to-pay cycle on either the part of an employee or a supplier or a third party. And sort of tangential to that allows us to find irregularities that may occur within spending and so on and so forth. So I'm looking at your data in a very narrow way. But what can you guys hear me?
If you could speak a little louder, that'd be great.
Yeah, I'm having a slight problem.
Perfect.
That's
perfect.
So I hope that's okay. Sorry about
that. Perfect. That's great.
Yeah, I'm not sure where you lost me, but the short story is we use a lot of enterprise data to find suspicious activity. What we're also doing, so again, in fraud, waste, and abuse, we take enterprise data and we try to enrich it with third-party data. So volume of data is something that we look for. It helps our analytics. And regarding AI or artificial intelligence, the beating heart of that is a form of modeling. That's really what it is. We have sat at SAS, of course, we're very good at data modeling. One of the challenges we've found within procure-to-pay analysis, though, for fraud detection, is that models need to be trained. So if I take a model that we have built at a national company and bring it to customer in consumer products or pharma or financial services or something, the model may not work very well because we need to train it. And the best way to train a model is obviously having very large volumes of historical data so that we can tune and optimize the analytics so that when they're presented with data now, we're able to make an informed decision. But data, of course, as everyone is saying, is absolutely central to our efforts. The modeling side of it is not trivial, but it's doable. And again, in my narrow world, we have seen significant uplifts. So, globally, not just the United States, but if you take sort of large mature economies out there, we're finding consistent returns on investments of somewhere between 12 and 20. So there are now, and that's not wholly a fraud number. I don't want everyone to think that there's loads of fraud. We do find employee fraud. It's not that common, but when it happens, it's significant. But the driver in our analytics is usually identifying irregularities in spending, some areas where ERP controls, things that auditors might have missed, et cetera, et cetera. Okay.
So if I want to just maybe have a few takeaways from that, because Chris, you gave us quite a lot of information, a lot to digest there. It sounds like a lot of what your work is looking at fraud waste, and it can happen both in employee fraud. It could potentially look at making use of open source data or other programming data and using it for our own, and then you end up with IP risk. And at the same time, what you're looking at is in driving machine learning, which means we really have to train these models, these machine learning models, with rules from which they can learn, and they can continue to learn in iteration. So it's fascinating from that perspective, how machine learning, it's not science fiction like Brad said, but we need to teach these tools first before they can learn. So it's really fascinating, the work that you're doing there at SAS. So one of the things that we also want to look at is, Brad, I want to talk to you based on your experience in banking, because it's a highly regulated industry. You're taking personal credit information, identifiable information, and leveraging it to deliver value back to your account holders and your card holders. How is data security and privacy? How is that now being handled by Capital One?
Yeah, it's a great question, Dupree. Certainly, it's increasingly important. It's always been important, but it's increasingly important, I think, to make sure from a security perspective, you've got your data managed right. So we as a company are kind of all about that, making sure we know exactly where our data is. Kind of basic things like registering within the system all the pieces of information and what types of data we have, and making sure we were able to kind of pull that story together across the entire kind of spectrum of all the systems that we have. You can imagine there's a number of different systems. They all have a lot of information. And so just basic things like registering it and going through it's painful, but you've got to do it, and it's super valuable so that you're actually in a spot where you know where your information is and what you have about folks. And from a supplier perspective, I think the opportunity on the risk side from a data standpoint is also increasing. It's increasingly challenging for us to manage our suppliers because of the amount of information they now have. And so pulling together that comprehensive view across data within Capital One and where is it spread out to all of our suppliers, I think is certainly a challenge, but something that we're focused on and is a must-do, I would say, at this point.
Thank you so much. So I guess, Gary, what are ways that from the tools that you provide your customers, where can you provide examples of where they're really getting value, and what kind of value are they getting? Are there quantifiable results that your customers are getting?
Well, yeah, there certainly are. I mean, we focus on supplier information management, where we're in most businesses, and certainly with relationships between buyers and suppliers, speed is currency, right? And risk mitigation is tremendously important in those relationships and those partnerships, right? So, and unfortunately, most organizations today, they've been unable to address these challenges with conventional means and technologies, right? So, for example, onboarding time, something as simple as onboarding a supplier could take in some organizations, that could be measured in months, as opposed to using technology that we offer, where that onboarding exercise can happen in a matter of hours. We've had examples of reducing cycle times from over 30 days down to just inside of 24 hours. So what our technology does is it addresses all of the pain points associated with the qualification of partnerships and suppliers. What credentials do they have? We bring third parties to the table that help provide an external view of a supplier's qualification. So this might be a financial, it might be an environmental, could be things like we talked about before related to compliance or privacy or IT, cybersecurity, things of that nature. And then there's the whole aspect of life cycle management. When you start to develop a partnership between organizations, that partnership changes rapidly over time, especially in this market, right? And so what our tool does is it allows suppliers to update information in real time, and suppliers and buyers to consume that information in real time to make critical decisions about the partnership going forward. Has the supplier entered in to a business negotiation in an embargoed nation? That's a really important piece of information for a buyer that doesn't want to be, in tomorrow's news because they're doing business with a supplier who has maybe a third party that's doing business in some kind of nation that's an embargoed list. So those are the kinds of pieces of information that technology around like AI, machine learning, blockchain technology can bring. We've recently introduced an AI component to our solution that looks for adverse media concerns that are in the marketplace, and it notifies constituents on our network about what's going on in the news so they can react to that. We're also introducing partners that do supply chain risk evaluations predictively, and allows the buyers and suppliers both to make decisions about how they're going to adjust components in their supply chain to continue to deliver product or services that they've made commitments on, right? So it's really all about, it is about trust, it is about speed, and it is about establishing a partnership that you can rely on as you move forward to deliver your core business competencies.
Great, thanks. I think part of what I wanted to leverage Matt on is Matt and I were on projects where at IBM we were basically the procurement leaders, outsourced procurement leaders in an outsourced model to large corporations when they wanted to find a more on-demand like workforce model and to solve and help them identify cost savings, simplify their supplier networks, improve their cash flow, working capital, and so forth. And this comes back to one of the questions, some of the results that came from our survey. And what this question was, what challenges does your company face in implementing AI-based technology? And 70% of the respondents came back and said the biggest problem lies in getting the IT resources and the actual investment from senior executives to implement these AI technologies. And then the other half of that was to the challenge in finding a skilled workforce that can use this technology and use it quickly and ramp up quickly. Matt, I know that in some of the consulting deals, you're trying to sell the value here of IBM's cognitive procurement services. Have you seen those kind of challenges, and maybe can you provide maybe some examples of how you've been able to help companies overcome those challenges?
Yeah, and it's certainly a challenge with a lot of companies we work with. And if you really think about the business process outsourcing business around procurement, it's fundamentally shifted over the last 10 years. It used to be more, how can I put butts in seats cheaper, kind of a traditional outsourcing model where you're offshoring more of the work. Whereas now clients are coming to us looking for more of a transformation partner. How can you actually help work with my procurement practitioners, not necessarily a pure outsource play, and use some of the technologies that you built internally to make their lives easier and make my procurement group more efficient. With that, there's definitely some hesitation when it comes to emerging technologies. So whether it's AI, some of the analytics work that we've done, blockchain. So what we've realized with a lot of companies is you have to either have referenceable clients that have done it before, and if that doesn't exist yet, then it's got to be something where you can show very quick proof of value. So we do proof of value assessments with a lot of our technologies for new clients, where within a 6 to 8 week period, we can ingest their data, utilize the technology, and show very rapid value, get that executive level buy-in in order to progress the engagement forward. We've learned very quickly if something takes 3, 4, 5 months to show a return on investment to clients, it's very difficult to sell.
It's a challenge, even internally from a corporate procurement. We're in the process of trying to implement machine learning tools to do spend analytics. What are we spending our money on, and with whom, and why? Does it make sense?
Yeah, completely agree. And some of the work we've done, we have a very large client that we're working with in Europe right now, a very mature procurement organization, and they had the question for us: how do you use AI in the data and analytics space to find value we haven't found before? And they were very hesitant because they do have a robust procurement organization today, and they thought that most of the low-hanging fruit was gone from a savings perspective. But the AI that we utilized was able to find a lot of actionable opportunity, especially in tail spend. It's something that a lot of companies just don't have time to focus a lot of time and energy on. Even IBM ourselves don't have a lot of time and energy to focus on tail spend. But when you utilize these AI-based technologies, you can find a lot of opportunity there within the data. And for that particular client, within the first year, we were able to show over a 20x ROI. So it's certainly a lot of opportunity out there if you're willing to go digging.
So I understand what you're talking about for tail spend. What is actually tail spend? Can you share with us what that is?
Yeah, no problem. So the way we look at tail spend is really the bottom 20% of a client's spend. So it's not with your strategic vendors typically. It's kind of those one-off purchases that happen day in and day out. You can control a lot of that through compliance measures and making sure that your buyers are utilizing your preferred suppliers, but you can't completely eliminate all of it. A lot of the time, people just don't go digging within that data set. If you look at the historical way that the industry has done spend analytics, it's been through script-based solutions. So when I see this supplier name, this GL account, or general ledger account, it equals this category, and that's the way you can kind of gain visibility to it. If you try to do that for every transaction down at the very bottom of your spend profile, it'd be almost impossible. But the emergence of AI technology that can really understand people's data, you can utilize the technology to evaluate that data at a much more rapid pace.
And Dupree, just to jump in there, I can't underscore what Matt said enough. You got to show the value. So if you're a supplier on the call, one of the things that we as consumers are always going to say is it's great that you've got this awesome sales pitch, but you have to use our data in a proof of concept to show that you can do it. And so I love the idea of really starting small with very small use cases. Certainly don't try to boil the ocean, but you've got to kind of prove the worth of the product through data from a consumer perspective. We've gotten ourselves in trouble in the past, some lessons learned where we found a solution. Oh, this thing looks awesome, best thing since sliced bread, and we went and tried to implement it. And if you don't understand what data you have, and you don't kind of prove it out through the information that you've got that's in your company, it becomes really challenging. So yeah, 100% agree with all the great points that Matt talked about there.
So here comes more of a brass tacks, really operational perspective, so that our attendees can take from this conference and start something now. What does it take? What does it take to do that kind of small kind of project? What is it? Both Brad, you and Matt were talking about start small. What are some three tips that our attendees can use to start small, and which kind of cases would be the most effective to start with to prove value?
Yeah, I'll take a stab, and Matt, you can chime in. I'll tell you a little bit about the process that we followed. And so we went down the path of sitting down with folks that are involved in risk management, involved in sourcing, involved in contracting. And we said, what are the things that you do today that are super manual and you think should be automated? And then, so that's a very long list, obviously. And there's a lot of tactical things to some fairly bold and aggressive things. And then we said, okay, well, now what are the things that you wish you could do if you had the time? And so what we learned is that second part of the conversation started to tease out the true, I'll say, machine learning sort of AI concepts. Things like, wouldn't it be cool if we didn't have to source, that we had a tool that kind of sourced for us automatically? Those kind of automagical is a word I use all the time in Capital One and people laugh, but what are the automagical solutions that people are like, gosh, wouldn't it be cool? Or imagine a world where we had a solution that did that. So just simply starting with a list from a brainstorm session perspective to just get some thoughts on paper and go through and pare those down and say, all right, what are the ones that make the most sense? Now, the second part of it is a lot of the sort of aspirational stuff requires you to have, data that's well constructed. So the second part is, all right, great. So all the use cases that you talked about, do we actually have data that's available to us that we can start to drive some new and innovative approaches to some of the problems that folks have?
That's a great point about it's okay to start with something, but if you don't have clean data, it's hard to put that into any kind of AI technology that would help you learn or help the machine to learn how to do it in the future.
Yeah, and I'll echo pretty much exactly what Brad said there. So one, taking an agile approach, and we do design thinking exercises with a lot of our clients where we sit down and walk through what are the kind of the biggest pain points by user group. So taking the personas in mind. So let's take a buyer. What are the pain points that drag down a buyer's day in and day out, and really focusing in on those areas. But you do kind of have to start with that end vision in mind. So where do you want to get to? It can be one of those ridiculous type thoughts, right? So could I have a robot that pulls up to my desk and sources something for me, right? All the way to that extreme. But you have to kind of piece that back and come back to something that's very tactical and achievable in the short term. And then build up from there. Obviously, you're probably never going to get to the point of a robot that sources for you, but you can figure out what's an intelligent workflow that makes this process a lot easier.
Thanks. Hey, Gary, I got a question on, Raj, go ahead, please.
Yeah, no, I was just going to chime in that, I think what Matt and Brad were talking about, starting small and, that's great, and delivering the value and showcasing the value as you go forward. But I think what we also have to do is that even though you start small, you have to design the solution, or you have to design it in a way that it's going to scale, right? So, you cannot, so you have to, not showcase value and then say that, well, you need like 10x more investment if you want to grow, or, return 10x more value. So you have to design those algorithms in a way that they scale, right? So you start small, but then you design for scale.
That's huge. That is huge. I think a lot of folks think also when it comes to science fiction that automation is going to cut away jobs. And, one of the survey findings here was that how to find the skilled workforce to jump into this AI space and embrace it. Maybe just an open question to you guys on that is automation really going to eliminate jobs? And if not, why?
So I'll take a stab at it, I guess. If I look at where automation probably could eliminate job roles, it would be more where there's highly manual, repeatable tasks. So I think about something like blocked invoice reconciliation. It's something that companies spend a lot of time and effort on and a lot of manpower. But at the end of the day, you can use some clever automation techniques to really eliminate most of that workload. Most of the AI, I'll say that we focus on within IBM is more so how do we make people's lives easier rather than just completely replacing job roles. So how do I take something like a buyer or a strategic sourcing practitioner and give them the tools and technology that enable them to drive greater savings from our organization and work more efficiently rather than try to eliminate that role altogether.
Thanks.
And Dupree, I'll just jump in. This is a question that's been asked for over 100 years, right? And so it really has, if you think about it. And I think what we found, and going back to what data would suggest, is that, you know, companies, really mature companies and companies that really perform, they concentrate on their core competencies, right? And so the more automation we can deliver, the more technology we can layer into some of these non-core competency processes, that we all have to do, the more bandwidth, the more capacity we have in terms of devoting resources to those things that we're in business to deliver, right? So, you know, not a lot of organizations are in business to source or to procure, right? That's a supporting activity for what we do, what kind of service or goods we bring to the marketplace, right? So, it's all about repurposing resources. You know, sometimes there's a human element to that. I think we all understand that. But anything that history has taught us is you know, human beings can be highly adaptable. And if we bring automation, it doesn't necessarily eliminate jobs, but it kind of repurposes where we're focused. And I think that's really an important concept for us to grasp is the introduction of technology, the introduction of simplicity and automation and speed. Those are all good things, and we should embrace them.
Yeah, it sounds like data, speed, and working smarter. Those are big takeaways I got from this question. One final question before we open it up to questions from our attendees. I see Raj has been busy answering some questions there on the side, so thank you for doing that. But one final thing is, what's one takeaway from our panel today that you want folks to what's one thing you want our attendees to take away from this conference, from our conversation now, that they could use today or tomorrow? Chris, why don't we start with you?
I hope you can hear me, guys.
Yeah.
I'm afraid things aren't too good at this end, but I think you asked about a takeaway.
Yeah. What's one thing that they could take now and start today with?
Yeah. Well, what I would suggest is the takeaway is that analytics can definitely help you, and a lot of the solutions out there are largely fully formed, as evidenced by the fact that we can deliver value in a very small number of weeks with a relatively small group of people. And the whole purpose of analytics is to sweat your corporate asset, which is the data that's just sitting out there on all those servers. And for sure, there is a lot of benefit to be released at very attractive return on investment ratios. I think it requires a cultural sort of situation within the organization. It has to be change oriented. And I mean, if that's your organization and you want to deliver value and improve productivity and reduce risk, et cetera, I believe that analytics is absolutely the way to go. It's getting better, not worse, and our ability to drive through change in a effective and sustainable manner is definitely there.
Great, Raj.
I hope you got that.
Thanks. What's one takeaway that you'd like to give these folks?
So from my standpoint, I think the one key takeaway is that, you know, it's not science fiction, it's real, it's happening now way more than people are thinking about. And there are within procurement several applications, whether you look at compliance or risk management or contracts, we talked about that, whether you look at you know, supplier onboarding and automating a lot of these, a lot of that is happening now. So I'm just just go out there and start reimagining your processes, start thinking and exploring where you can add more value and deliver more insight to your stakeholders.
Brad, what's one thing you want these folks to take away?
Yeah, I'm going to echo a little bit about what Raj said. Just get started. Just take a stab and get started. Pick a small use case and go out there and just jump in as much as you can. And the other big thing for me is don't be overwhelmed about all these terms we're talking about: machine learning, AI, RPA. Like, once you dig, folks know your business, and you guys know what you're doing from a business perspective. So, and you know your use cases. So I would just say, get started and don't be overwhelmed or scared by the crazy technology words we like to throw around.
Hey, Gary, what's one thing you'd like for us to take away?
Well, in addition to echoing everybody's else's thoughts, certainly the world of procurement is getting more complex, not less. We talked about regulatory concerns, things like GDPR and data privacy, cybersecurity, the new normal after the pandemic. All of these things are going to create a more complex procurement environment, and so we're going to need to embrace tools and technology. It's not a nice to have. It's going to be a necessity for us to embrace these tools and these technologies for us to be able to function efficiently, to drive out cost, to be competitive in the marketplace, all the things that we talked about, right? So, I think the takeaway is it's getting more complex, not less. Let's embrace the technology. Let's make it part of our DNA, and let's use that as our advantage going forward.
Hey, Matt, you're going to wrap it up with you, and then we're going to take a few questions from the attendees.
Yeah, I'll just echo what most of our other panelists said, because I think they took most of the key points there. But don't be afraid to embrace the technology today. It's certainly real. It's certainly there, and it's not something that if you want to be a leading organization, you can just wait on at this point, because there are so many organizations that are already taking advantage of these types of tools and capabilities. And also, don't be afraid to fail when it comes to the implementation of these technologies. Fail fast and course correct and be agile with it. And that's something that we've had to learn the hard way with many clients, but it's certainly the path to long-term success.
Thanks. So I think we've got a question from Roger Stone. You can unmute Roger and let him answer his question. That'd be great.
Yep. Hi, Roger. You are now unmuted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. Marcus, I've heard a lot about algorithms using historical data and which they would predict success based upon historical data, really just perpetuating biases in people with respect to hiring, promoting, lending, and efforts to address that. Could the panel address that as it relates to suppliers? I mean, what's the risk of developing algorithms based on historical predictors of success, and how do we address it? What are the risks and how do we address it? Because I think that's a big issue to our minority suppliers.
Matt, why don't we look at it from your perspective? I know you guys are building cognitive analytics models, not just with procurement, but that seems to be IBM's bread and butter.
It is. So we do a lot of work with data and analytics. When it comes to predictive models, using your historical data alone usually doesn't create a full picture, right? Because oftentimes there's gaps in data, and especially when you start talking 2, 3, 4 years back, which is really the quantity of data you need to produce a high quality predictive model. A lot of the times there are so many gaps that you do have trouble relying on it. But one of the things that these AI technologies bring into play is the ability to rapidly pull in large amounts of market data. Whether that's publicly available or reaching out and procuring those different pieces of market intelligence is very vital to plugging those holes in your data. So I would say really any company, regardless of how mature their historical data is, if you're able to augment that with a large amount of market intelligence and publicly available data that you can pull in through web crawling and other techniques with cognitive and AI, there's certainly value there to be unlocked.
Yeah, that definitely sounds a way to unlock your. A lot of times in sourcing, what you end up doing is looking at those algorithms to figure out what you've done within your company, and then it's really important when you do sourcing, as everyone knows, to see who else in the market is out there doing that kind of thing and in the industry, and then figuring out are we laggards or leaders in that kind of spectrum. Raj, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, I think I was just going to add to what Matt was talking about. So there are, if within your data set you have some sort of a gender bias or you have some sort of a, age bias, etc., there are ways to de-bias. So there are algorithms and there are approaches out there at the technology level that you can actually de-bias that, right? So there are multiple ways. I know that we can apply the same in the context of suppliers as well, but if we understand the bias, if we are aware of what the bias is, we can create algorithms to de-bias those predictive outcomes.
Well, Chris, that sounds like that's right up your alley as well, looking at fraud and looking at algorithms, because sometimes it could be a false positive for fraud.
Yeah, precisely.
Cool. Hello?
Gotcha. Yeah, we got you. We got you, Chris. It sounds like with algorithms, you could prove finding false positives too, right?
Yeah, well, first of all, I thought that's a really good question, so thank you, Roger. Just to touch on what Matt mentioned, historical data is real important, but it's often of questionable quality, and it's not unusual to have little bits missing. And the use of external data, reference data or market data, is real important. Of course, in our world, one of the things that we have found is that modeling on its own is not a panacea. So we have a concept called hybrid analytics, and that's just a fancy term to refer to the fact that we use complementary types of data analytics to look at historical and market data. So we will have rules at one end, and then there's a variety of techniques, network analytics and so on, all the way up to some fairly advanced modeling. So when those are applied in aggregate, we find that it's a very good way of driving down false positive rates. You will never eliminate false positives. A good false positive situation in the world of fraud, waste, and error is usually sort of 2 to 1. I have seen, in fact, the worst I've ever seen was 33,000 to 1 at a customer in Nigeria, believe it or not. It was so bad they might as well have turned the system off. But false positives are just part of life. False negatives can also be very, very difficult. But what we try and do, of course, is adopt practical analytical techniques to drive them down. And what we found, look, I guess it's nearly baseball season in the States. So if you went out to the backyard for some batting practice, you're probably better after 100 hours than after 1. So what we find is the more we do this, the better we get, and the better our ability to tune analytics, etc., becomes. So that's how we tackle it. But modeling is real good. It's very important. It's part of the future, but it's not the panacea.
Right. Thanks for the question, Roger. You generated quite a good set of reactions there from our panel. Next question I'd like to bring up is from Sharonetta McIntyre. I hope I pronounced your name right.
Hi, Sharonetta. You are now unmuted.
Hi there. I just wanted to get some indication of cost that we may be dealing with. If you're thinking about just a low-end application, of putting the AI to a contract management, kind of risk management, just to get some idea of what a basic cost might be.
Raj, it sounds like for contract management, huh?
Yeah, no, I can take that, and it's hard to assess without looking at the volume and the scope of the work, but I think it probably would be just in the range of, I mean, it could be just as low as 50 to 100K if you have skilled people and you just need to kind of get access to the open source library. So it's just a matter of time that you can just, start coding it yourself. I mean, we've done that too. So it could be between 100K, but then if you want to go out there in the market and acquire some software, etc., it could be to $1 million as well. So it just depends on the scope and what's the volume of contracts that you're looking at. But I mean, if you want to just go real low, you could start with like 50 to 100K and get going.
Gary, from your world, that sounds like it could be also in risk and also some risk elements in the tool that you're providing. What's been your experience?
Yeah, so I'll echo what Raj says. It's really highly dependent on scope and scale. Our tool, for example, is a subscription model, so it's $100 a month. If that helps gauge it from a supplier's perspective, and then relatively inexpensive. But there's other tools inside the enterprise that attract cost as well. So when you and we're not just looking at the technology costs here, but also the the cost of the human capital. But you also have to weigh the cost with the savings, right? And I think that's a very important part of the equation. Is look at the overall value proposition and the ROI, right? So we're all attracted to cost immediately. How much is this thing going to cost me? But the real analysis is, what's the business case look like, right? Can you do this? And this is going to save me money, and this is going to allow me to refocus energy elsewhere.
Thanks. Hopefully, sharing out of that helped. It really, I have to echo that. We've just recently implemented a contract lifecycle management platform as well at Toshiba, and it really, you've got to be able to look at, when you ask one of those providers out there in the space, you've got to be able to have an understanding of your own organization. Are you small domestic US? Are you international? Does your procurement organization deal with suppliers in multiple languages? Different types of agreements? Are they just standard boilerplate? Or do you find yourself, if you were in an M&A situation, are you going to have to figure out what those companies that your company acquired did in terms of contracts? I had that very same thing at Delta Airlines, where Northwest managed their procurement in one way and Delta did it in another. And so we had to learn from one another and figure out, what's the new Delta model for contracting? What does that look like? It took a lot, I think we talked about that, it took a lot of planning and a lot of introspection, but we were able to deliver some value, and I anticipate at Toshiba we're going to deliver some value too. So are there any other questions then from our conference attendees?
We do. We have a question from Satrina. I believe Raj did address it in the chat, but I would love to unmute her so she can ask a question for the rest of the panelists.
Thanks.
Satrina, you are unmuted.
Hi. Someone posted that in the chat, and I just copied it into the Q&A.
Oh, okay, perfect. All right. Well, thank you for letting us know. So another question we have here is from Dominique. So I'm going to go ahead and unmute Dominique. Dominique, you are now unmuted.
Can you hear me?
Sure thing.
So I asked a lot of questions. I'm going to see which one it was. So, from start to finish, like if I am a supply chain professional and I want to go through this implementation process, what is a realistic expectation of, how long this whole process will take to go from not having AI to being full-blown and operational with AI in my supply chain?
If you don't mind, guys, I'm going to maybe chime in first on that, and maybe we could address it in different ways. Dominique, I would say, again, it requires some introspection to figure out how big, if you want to go big bang, if you want to do like what Brad and Matt said, start small and find a few test cases to prove the value. The time and money that it will take, it just varies. And for what purpose? What type of AI do you want to do? Do you want to bring in Raj to help you with contracts? Do you want Gary to help you find ways to trust your suppliers? Want Matt's team to come in and help you analyze who you're spending with and why? Maybe we can. Are there specific examples maybe from the panel in any of those areas about time to implement?
So I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there, Dupree. It depends on how big of a chunk you want to bite off, right? And also just how willing your organization is to adopt the new capabilities. So you have to have, buy-in across your organization to adopt whatever technology you're going to put in place. And if you can't convince those resources to change the way they've done things historically for the last 20 years, it's going to be an uphill battle. So once you get that buy-in, if you're smart and tactful about how you implement AI, I would say you can be live in a 60 to 90 day period with at least trial use cases of AI for specific processes, and then you can grow from there. But you have to at least get something going. And I think to the point I made earlier, if you start with the expectation it's going to take 9 months or even 4 or 5 months to prove value, it's a very difficult battle with your finance organization to gain the investment. So start small, go with something you can get done in a 30, 60 day period, and then grow from there.
Great point.
And to jump in real quick, Dupree, just to throw a bone to the agile way. I think the agile process in focusing on kind of what is an MVP deliverable you're trying to get out will help you make sure you're not trying to boil the ocean. So, what we did is we kind of created a team of experts, if you will, in each of the different areas, brought them together, called them the agile team for what we're trying to do from a capabilities perspective, and then started to iterate through over time. So you just got to be careful not to try to bite off more than you can chew. But that agile delivery focus on, sprint by sprint, what are we going to get done? What delivery are we trying to drive towards? I think will also help guide and get you value, hopefully, over time in a faster way.
So from agile, you mean maybe do it in iterations versus a full-on start-to-finish type model, correct?
Exactly, yeah. So, certainly the big bang of, hey, we've got a 6 to 9 month project, at times could be appealing, but I love the agile way of what are we going to deliver? Every 2 weeks, there should be something that we're delivering, depending on how long your sprints are and your cadence. But, the focus on trying to get something out the door in production that people can use. It might not have everything you want, but just give them something, because I think that's the way you learn as well. You might have an idea from a use case perspective, but the earlier you give people something to use, the more feedback you're going to get, and the better the ideas are going to come to you.
Great. So maybe we can go to another question. These questions are starting to jump up here, right, Shelby?
Yes, they are. And the next question is going to be from John Carlos. So, John, you are now unmuted to ask your question.
Yeah, y'all are talking about contracts, but the real risk is the loss of the supply chain, as we've seen just recently, due to natural causes, terrorist events, and political retaliations like tariffs. Is there a tool for evaluating these risks?
So in the past, we have leveraged a combination of tools, right? So there is the operational risk, there is the financial risk, there is the natural disaster risk. So those are all sort of predictive models. And in each of those different areas, you have different tools. So for financial risk assessment, there is, D&B, Duns & Bradstreet, they have a service that they provide for financial assessment. Operational risk is something that you have to assess yourself, how deep your supply chain is and how many layers you're going to go deep into. And then from a natural disaster standpoint, there are weather models, even the weather.com, right? And there are predictive models out there on different across the globe, right? If you have hurricanes, if you have, typhoons, all those, models are out there. So you can start to build that into your own situation, right? So there are models out there that predict all different aspects, but then you have to bring it home and looking at your own supply chain, looking at your own exposure, you have to develop by building on top of those models. And that's how we've done it. Awesome.
No, this is good questions. Good questions. Who else is next on our list, Shelby?
Yep, so our next participant who has a question is going to be Julie Powers. So Julie, you are now unmuted to ask your question.
Hi, can you hear me okay, Shelby?
We certainly can, yes.
Perfect. So I heard one of the panelists, I believe it was Brad, mention earlier that we must have clean data in order to expect the return on investment that we want to get from our AI endeavors. And so I was just curious if the panelists have seen any correlation between companies who have implemented MDM programs with better return on investment for their AI initiatives, or if there's really not any correlation between that.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. It's Brad. I'll start. Absolutely, I think from a Capital One perspective, and I'll give you a specific example, and it's sort of a little bit of a twist on MDM, but it's I think relevant to your question, and that is just the basic question on how many suppliers does Capital One have? It really depended on, prior to us implementing some new things, it depended on us being whatever system you're logged into, that was sort of the answer, because things weren't named the same in all the different systems. And so we leveraged an MDM solution to kind of bring all that data together, if you will, in one view. And so now if you're a practitioner, if you're a supplier manager, or you're a sourcing manager, a contract manager within Capital One, we've got a system and a tool now that brings information together from our ERP system, from our contract system, from our risk management system, kind of all in one place. And so now we're able to kind of see all that together in one view, which is dramatically different than where we were, 2 years ago. So that was for us the first thing. And then that unleashes, in my opinion, a bunch of other capabilities that now that we have connected data between those systems, we can actually see. Things like diversity spend. We can now see that in a very simple view at a supplier level that it was hard to find before. And so information gathering and bringing that stuff together in one place for us was kind of a transformational thing.
Points to share. Thanks for your question, Julie. So, who's next in the line? This has been really good conversation.
We have some questions that were answered in the chat, but I think it would be great to discuss it with all of our attendees. So I'm going to unmute Carol Junkelis, and that way she can ask her questions to all the attendees. Carolyn, you are now unmuted. Don't think we're going to be able to hear her audio. So what I'll do is I'll read the question for the panelist. And so the question is, what tool does Cisco use to review these contracts from acquired companies? And I think this was directed to Raj. So Raj, if you could just kind of clarify that for the rest of the group, that'd be great.
Yeah, so we have SAP Ariba as our underlying contract lifecycle management platform, but then we have digitized the contracts on top of that. And then once you digitize those contracts, then it enables you to start opening up the possibilities of comparing the language, the same term across your entire repository, right? And at the same time, you not only, once you standardize that language, you can start to look at that, well, as you acquire new companies and as you acquire new contracts in your current repository, right, you can do the comparison and you can understand the variability across the risk profiles. So, so part of it is SAP Ariba, part of it is just homegrown Python machine learning algorithms. So those algorithms are basically classifiers. So we look at a language and we classify, and we then compare and contrast. So it's basically a section of you parse, you read, you classify, and then you compare. So in terms of, if you want to go technical, those are the actual sequence of events that happen, right, for you to start delivering value to your stakeholders.
Matt, from your perspective, IBM's also been on a buying spree. How have you guys used that?
Yeah, so from a contract perspective, so we use Ariba Contract Lifecycle Management as our source of truth, just to digitize all of our contracts, which is really a first step. Secondary to that, we've used the Watson Discovery Content Intelligence API as a secondary application sitting on top to do more of the natural language processing and some of the more intelligent work within contracts. So from a contract authoring perspective, being able to have recommendations around best-in-class clauses and terms for specific types of contracts, we've done within that technology. One of the things that we learned very quickly is that those APIs are excellent for their ability to understand natural language, but they're not specifically domain trained. So when we started utilizing that technology, it didn't know any standard procurement terms or any of the types of contracts that we negotiate as procurement practitioners. So it does take some training and curation. But ultimately, what we've tried to do with our cognitive contracting asset now that we take to market in the procurement space is trying to figure out how do you take the training that we've done with IBM and our other clients and make it commercially available to other companies.
Good question as always. I think we got maybe time for one more question.
Yeah, absolutely. So the next person I'm going to unmute is Nicole Janine. So Nicole, you are now unmuted to ask your question. Okay, I'll go ahead and ask that question for the group. So Nicole's question is, how do you position yourself to compete as a supplier of AI, and how do you help consumers understand at what level they can compete through AI?
Matt, maybe we can answer that because it sounds like you just talked about commercialization.
Yeah. So really the way we start with most of our clients is just trying to understand what their pain points are, right? So every client wants to kind of hear the buzzword of AI and all the solutions we bring to them. And we could go about just, putting a menu on the table and saying this is everything we can do and all the different AI capabilities that IBM can bring to the table. But what we found more often than not is that if clients try to use technology as just a Band-Aid to their existing processes, it's really not the best way to approach the use of AI within procurement. So what we try to do is kind of look at the process in more detail, that particular client, try to identify where the pain points are, and then be more prescriptive with what types of AI we can implement and in very short terms in most cases to prove the value and grow in an agile manner, just like Brad had mentioned.
So it sounds like really listen to your customer first and be ready and nimble enough to tailor a solution to meet those needs.
Yeah, exactly. If you try to go in with a canned capability and try to force fit it to the client's needs, it's very difficult to show success. So, as a provider ourselves of AI technology, being very flexible and understanding the client's pain points and having that domain expertise is absolutely critical.
Great. Hey, Gary, from your perspective, is this technology that you guys are also commercializing?
Yeah, a component of our tool, Trust Your Supplier tool, it contains AI, and so that capability allows third-party information and other automation of supplier onboarding. So there was a question in the chat I was just about to respond to, and I think it's relevant here. It's supplier onboarding as just to take a snippet of the process, right? That our whole goal is to drive reduction in that life cycle, and then so through uses of AI and other technology, I mentioned this before, we've rapidly compressed that time cycle down to something that can be measured in hours, right? In fact, we've developed a solution to address non-traditional suppliers for COVID. We call it Rapid Supplier Connect, and we have onboarded suppliers to hospitals, non-traditional suppliers to hospitals for PPE, and we've done that in minutes. So that's how rapid AI can help drive these solutions. Now that's an extremely specific use case. That's not a metric you probably want to measure against. But the point is that there is technology out there that is continuing to help drive some of these processes, compressing time cycles, enhancing knowledge and capability and decision making, driving out cost, and improving the workflow. So these are I talked about this before. This is just embracing the technology on top of your existing process And then the last step there, of course, is something I think that Brad might have mentioned earlier, is it's about adoption and value realization, right? So there's one thing to implement all of this technology, right, and all the associated benefits you get, but you have to ensure you realize the value, right? So the final step in the puzzle really is getting that value out of it. How are you measuring how much value you're getting out of your technology investment, out of your process changes, out of your digital transformation, and ensuring that's helping the business?
So it sounds like a big selling position. If you're an AI supplier, sell the speed, but make sure you can actually deliver the speed.
Right.
Perfect. And the last question I wanted to ask is for Sharonetta. So I'm going to go ahead and unmute Sharonetta's line, and you can ask your question now, Sharonetta.
Hi. I actually asked a question about the supplier onboarding process. You talked about how it was significantly reduced through AI. Just wondering, do you have any examples of how that might also apply just for general employee onboarding in terms of shortening the process?
So, Dupree, I'll take a shot at that. Our tool doesn't address employee onboarding, but conceptually, you're talking about, when you're talking about onboarding, what you're really doing is evaluating the qualifications, the credentials of the entity that you're onboarding, whether that's a company or a contractor or an employee at RT. You're evaluating those qualifications against your standards, against regulatory standards, against any kind of business requirements you might have, right? So the more capability you bring forward with technology to automate that, whether it be AI or other means, absolutely you're going to be able to shorten the time cycle. We talked about before where it's getting more complicated, right? So there's more complexity in our procurement world, or maybe perhaps in our HR world as we bring on our new employees. So certainly technology is going to have to drive against that growing complexity, so we shorten those time cycles. And that's kind of what our solution does. Is it looks, our value proposition to suppliers is, hey, we're going to reduce the redundancy by giving you an opportunity to create a singular identity. And then for procurement organizations, we're going to give you the opportunity to onboard by having a digital identity that you can consume very quickly. So all of those things are, real, and they're happening today. And by implementing these things, you can take advantage of them.
So, Chris, you wanted to add some context to that too.
I did. Thank you, Dupree. Sharon, thank you for your question, and I hope you can hear me. It's a very apt question, Sharon. So we at SAS have actually been working with some customers to build out some solutions that are related closely to our procurement analysis. And one of those solutions is called Employee Integrity. And it's designed to do exactly what Gary was talking about. So we also have now an automated mechanism to allow a client using Employee Integrity to interrogate the employee data, verify it, to make sure that you are in line with the various policy and regulatory requirements of the area that you're working in. And we also do it for supplier integrity, but in employees, one of the things that we've also noticed is that whilst there is a bit of there's work done when you onboard a person to your organization, but frequently there's not a great deal of time or effort spent on conducting periodic due diligence on employees. So for example, has an employee declared commercial interest in a supplier? If I join your organization, I have no relationship with supplier X, but during the tenure of my employee, I perhaps acquire some shares or a commercial interest in a supplier. And that should be declared on a regular basis, but in the real world, we have found that that's often something that's just not on the to-do list for legal compliance, HR, or indeed the employee. So that's just a little example of particular area that we can allow the analytics to interrogate. It's very cheap and easy to do when it's all kind of set up properly. And these are ultimately designed to provide a level of assurance to the organization that employees remain compliant with regulatory and internal policy requirements. So I'm sure there are many other tools out there that kind of do this stuff, but certainly at SAS, it is an area where we have seen significant interest out there in our clients, and we're in a position to try and help, and it can be set up very, very easily.
Great, Chris. This has been great. I thought I knew a lot about AI, but you guys have definitely upped all of our game, I think, when it comes to learning about the different shapes and forms and ways of seeing AI from a completely different view. It's not science fiction, like Raj and Brad said. It's real, it's out there, it's being used, and it's delivering value across the board. So again, thank you so much for taking the time today.
It is my pleasure to introduce our host for our next session, Jonathan Wilkins, Supplier Diversity Program Manager of Lenovo.
Good morning, everyone. I hope that everyone's doing well and enjoying the session thus far. I am Jonathan Wilkins, and I'm the Program Manager for Supply Diversity at Lenovo. We're excited to be able to introduce to you our next panelist, our next our guest speaker for the day, our main speaker, who is Dr. Ezekiel Dixon Roman. He is an associate professor at the University of Pennsylvania. I had the opportunity to meet him through actually his mother. His mother works at Lenovo, and she was doting over how brilliant her son was and gave me an article to read about him. And in doing so, I looked at her and said, I have no idea what I just read, but I am very intrigued. And later on, the opportunity came about because I did comprehend some of what was in the article and about AI and the work that he does. And I was able to introduce him to our team that put together the panel discussion today, this forum today. And he has been a thought leader in this industry, looking at data analytics and social policy. He also he's the chair of the Masters of Science and Social Policy program at the University of Penn. And his main focus is on how power and integrity are reproduced, especially in human learning and development, and in the ways in which socio-technical systems of quantification work. At this time, I'll turn it over to Dr. Ezekiel Dixon Roman.
Can you? Oh. Can you all hear me? Yeah. Okay. Just wanted to make sure. Okay. And just given the some of the difficulties from the last session, I just want to make sure you all can hear me clearly and there aren't any muffling or anything like that. So am I good? And I just want to verify.
You are perfect, Dr. Dixon.
Awesome. Okay, great. So I want to first begin by thanking more broadly the Carolinas Virginia Minority Supplier Development Council for inviting me to join you all this morning / moving into the afternoon. I guess it also depends on where you are in the world. Also wanted to extend my appreciation to Dominic Milton, Andrea Horn, and Jonathan Wilkes as well for the invitation. And I wanted to extend my appreciation and thanks for each of you all as the audience and participants for joining this Proforum. So let me begin with, Jonathan, are we going to go into questions, or should I
you can do a brief introduction of yourself. I will say some housekeeping rules for everyone that is all about those in listening, viewing right now. If you have any questions, put them out in the chat and we'll answer them as we go. But go right ahead and do your introduction and we'll move into some of the questions for you.
Perfect. Okay, just wanted to clarify. So, yeah, as Jonathan already mentioned, I'm an associate professor at the University of Pennsylvania. Much of my background is in the social sciences and psychometrics, and my PhD, in fact, is in psychometrics, and out of one of the few programs that still exist in the country. Much of my work throughout my career has been around technologies and practices of quantification and the ways in which they configure and processes of power and marginalization. And what are the ways in which we can rethink, reimagine, and redesign these very technologies toward addressing processes of social reproduction, processes of inequities, and more broadly, even issues of structural racism, systemic racism, and oppression. And so part of my work early on began focusing in the area of educational testing and standardized testing, including the SAT, the LSAT, and the GRE and others. But much of my work in the past several years have been specifically in the area of algorithmic governance and the employment of machine learning and AI more broadly in the area of public policy. Some of the work that I've done has been specific to in the area of predictive policing and the use of supervised machine learning as a risk assessment for parole and probationary hearings. Other lines of work has been around learning analytics and different areas of learning analytics and questions of inequities in learning analytics, as well as a more probably apropos one in our current context that has to do with the Russian internet agency's use of the Facebook ad algorithm during the 2016 presidential election, and the ways in which they were using the ad algorithm and in order to shape political behaviors and decision making. So, I mean, in a nutshell, that's who I am and what I'm about and what I do.
Thank you for that introduction. Let's jump right on in. So in the last, during the panel discussion, the question was brought up regarding biases that could be built into AI technology. I know IBM has looked at the technology of AI with Watson and trying to mitigate some of those risks associated with bias. But from your perspective, give the audience an idea of what are some of those expected risks that could be out there that they could particularly face.
Yeah, this is a great question, and Jonathan, I teach a course called Democratizing Data, where we spent pretty much 14 weeks on this topic. So literally, we can spend a whole long time on this topic. That said, I'm going to try to speak to sort of 5 different particular and not unrelated, but very much related processes that lead to, I'm going to use the language algorithmic discrimination, and I'll unpack as to why I'm going to stay away from the language bias for the moment, but whatever language one wants to use is fine. And then I'll also speak to some examples where we can see this materialize in various everyday practices or everyday technologies. So first, and this is a really deeply important one, algorithms, just like statistical models and even measurement models, algorithms are models in and of themselves. And by definition, a model is a finite system. And so as a finite system, by definition, it's going to approach some information that's incompressible. This is a deeply important just sort of given, and we just need to go into, when we're using algorithms, we need to go into them understanding that this very fact. The world is made up of not finite information, the world is made up of infinite information, and in fact, dynamic information, as we have seen through the pandemic. And the reality is, any algorithm that we have developed, that we've designed, that we've trained, is a finite system. And eventually it will approach some form of uncompressible information. And so the question is, what then happens when it approaches that incompressible information? It all depends on the algorithm and what, in fact, how it's designed to handle that information. But it's also a result of that we also begin to see various forms of algorithmic discrimination that occur, because that incompressible information is actually real information. It's a result of something. It's a result of some kind of processes in the world. And so because that algorithm may not be able to compress that information, it's going to actually misbehave as a result in various ways. Another one that is that's not unrelated to the first one has to do with data. And this was touched on in the panel, and I appreciate the various ways in which the panel spoke to this. But I think it's just, to sort of piggyback on some of what they said, we just need to recognize is imperfect. There's no such thing as pure data. In fact, even the idea of raw data is an oxymoron in and of itself. Data is that which is generated. It's that which is produced. We create data. And the question is what are the various parameters? What's the infrastructures in which we are actually producing that data? And how does those parameters of that infrastructure of producing that data actually shape certain social, political, cultural processes into the data in and of itself? So period, we just need to recognize and understand that data is always going to have some degree of social, cultural, and political processes, whether it has to do with the policy context that the data is being generated under, the cultural practices and assumptions that the data is being generated from, the political economic context, even a context of a pandemic, even a context of a global uprising. All of this leads to producing shifts and leanings in data. It influences the data, the production of data in and of itself. And so with that, when we take that data and train an algorithm on it, which, as was mentioned, we have to train algorithms. An algorithm is not going to perform if it's not trained on some set of existing data or history of data that, as has been mentioned. That algorithm, even if we can imagine an unbiased, in an ideal world, a perfect algorithm, an algorithm that is not influenced by any kind of social, unethical, or political or cultural processes, that algorithm will hands down be influenced by the very processes and logics of that data. The constitution and formation of that data will become part of the very logics of the algorithm itself. And so once we train that algorithm on that data that's already biased, or to use that term, or has some degree of social, cultural, and political values imbued in it, it's going to take those logics on. And as a result, some might say it mirrors the social, cultural, and political processes, social inequalities in the world, political processes in the world. I actually don't completely agree with it. I think it depends on the algorithm in which it actually is taking it on and processing it, and then as a result, how it's outputting, whether it mirrors it or actually reconfigures it in new ways. So really, that's the context of which really depends on how that algorithm is being, the type of algorithm, how it's designed, and how it's being used, by to the extent to which it's actually mirroring the social world. And that so we can talk about that further. If there are questions more about that, I'm happy to address that. But it's definitely, I don't want to take us too far off on a tangent there. So training data, the training data matters substantially. And so you want to be very careful and selective and thoughtful about what training data you use. And relatedly, what's the purpose of the use of the algorithm? What's the context of the use of that algorithm? You want to be very thoughtful about what algorithms you're using, what are the assumptions that it's making, and what are its purposes in which you're trying to implement it for. Is that algorithm designed for that? Is that algorithm the best use of that? And then finally, the last thing I'll mention is the operationalizing of variables, or how we go about forming and constructing variables that we seek to predict. So particularly in the supervised machine learning modeling context, in the predictive analytics context, there's a criterion, there's a variable, there's something we're seeking to predict, and we actually have to operationalize that. We have to go about figuring out how we're going to construct that thing that we're seeking to predict, whether it's savings, or a particular skill set of a workforce that we're seeking to get, or success in something. That thing, that criterion, that output, that outcome, has to be operationalized. And the question is, how do we define and operationalize it? It's at that very point, in those very processes, where we begin to see the subjective influence of our own social, cultural, and political subjectivities and biases, to use that term, working its way in. I'll speak to a couple of examples here, but I want to be mindful of time too, Jonathan, because like I said, I can go on this one.
Understood.
But I'll speak to just a few examples, and then we can move on to the next question. So first, it was mentioned earlier about hiring and promoting algorithms, and how those algorithms, as an example, these algorithms in particular have been known, empirically been found to actually demonstrate and materialize in algorithmic discrimination. And in fact, the ways in which that comes about, again, has a lot to do with the data. So in this instance, it's not too much different from what we do as humans. So the data proxies of name, so what types of names that people have, and whether they have, whether there are racial ethnic names being used. In fact, the algorithms will pick that up just like humans do. The schools that one has went to, algorithms will pick that up. It's just fundamentally, mathematically speaking, the clustering of any particular algorithm is going to actually pick that up. Address, zip code, is also, the algorithms will also pick that up as well. And then, in addition, the work history of any particular applicant. So, for instance, those who have less of a work history will likely be discriminated. Discriminated. Yeah, I will use that. Will likely be discriminated against in relation to someone who has a much longer work history. Now, when we put that in relation to having a lower or smaller work history in relation to someone who graduated from Harvard University, there's a way in which actually the school name might have a greater weighting in order to get them in that job versus someone who came from such and such a less well-known school that gets a lower weighting from that algorithm. So I think these are things that we need to keep in mind, and especially when we're thinking about how we want to implement algorithms in our business practices and in procurement. The second example I'll speak to is an example from with Amazon. And with Amazon, we it's a proprietary algorithm for their search algorithm, and so we don't necessarily know exactly what Amazon is using, so we can't actually see it, if you will. But there has been work that has suggested that, or that has indicated, and in fact, even Amazon has stated this themselves, that in the search algorithm for Amazon, what gets listed in their product listing is prioritized based on product profitability. So this means, which I mean, obviously from Amazon's standpoint, this makes sense, but from the standpoint of a startup, a small business, a business that's actually targeting maybe a different population, particular markets, their product profitability is less likely to be as high, and so as a result, will be less likely to be as prioritized on Amazon's list. And I'm just using this as an example of how we can begin to see these algorithmic forms of discrimination playing out in various everyday forms of technology and practices that actually have direct implications to supply chain development, to business enterprises, particularly minority-owned business enterprises. I could speak to a few more if you'd like, Jonathan, but I definitely want to be mindful and move on to another question if you like.
I do have a question. Let's go back to there's two parts. So I want a question about the Google and Amazon example that you just had. But also before that, you mentioned the data input and how that was being utilized in the early stages of development of the algorithms. Mm-hmm. Someone mentioned on the panel about the agile teams that were being developed or being pulled together to come up with the constraints for the algorithms. Does diversity play a role, or how do you see diversity playing a role in those agile teams as it relates to the algorithm input and ultimately the output of the algorithm? And then the second part is, going to the Google question, is how can suppliers best optimize their position to move up higher in that list to be more visible or to absolutely win more opportunities when it comes to procurement?
So in the first question, is it agile teams? Am I hearing you correctly? Mm-hmm. So this is a bit, I'm going to give a sort of a complicated response to this, in part because on the one hand, I think there's a way in which identity politics can play out in this, and that is to say representation. So can we build teams that have greater diversity on them? And I think this is a deeply important aspect. As it's a necessary, although I'm going to say not sufficient. And there are various ways in which I could see this being complicated as well. But here's the issue. On the one hand, if we don't have racial ethnic diversity or just diversity period on any teams that are part of the design and development of any system and process, there are particular perspectives that get left out. There are particular voices and experiences that don't become part of the very process of designing that very system, that very techno-social system, if I may say. However, the problem is we cannot assume that those perspectives, experiences, and processes get brought in just by adding diversity to a team. In other words, identity and representation teamed with actual substantive content and process is deeply important. If we focus on one without the other, we're going to miss something deeply important in how discriminatory practices, how bias works into these systems. To the Google question, you can pay Google to get your to have your product, your website show up higher in the search. And I know this personally as a director of a program where we've been able to do that in order to make sure that our program shows up high in the prioritized in the when it comes to searches on social policy master's programs. So this is, I mean, as we know, there's ways in which money does actually produce advantage, and in this instance, this is a prime example. Otherwise, the other way is a more it's sort of an understanding of the logic of the Google search algorithm and of technosocial systems and how to play the logic, literally. So we know that prioritizing of certain websites on Google beyond paying is based on the amount of clicks, the amount of times that website that users are going to that website. Well, there are things that we can do, particularly via social media, in order to build greater awareness of our websites, in order to get greater clicks on our website. And that's another way of understanding the logic and literally playing the game of that logic in order to prioritize and enhance where our websites end up in that search. and Jonathan, I want to make sure I answered your first question and understood and answered your first question. So let me know.
Yes, you did, which is a very interesting concept because we often hear once we have more diversity in the room that the output will be different, but the construct has to be laid out that not only diversity, but the content that's being developed by the diverse individual also has to play an important role in the algorithmic output.
That's right. I'll use a quote from a former mentor of mine and also famous Black feminist and queer studies scholar by the name of Kathy Cohen. She's a political scientist at the University of Chicago. She argued years ago, it's not your identity, it's your politics that I care about, that I'm concerned about. So your identity is important, but if you don't come with the politics, and in this instance, we can think about filling in something else with politics here. If you're not coming with the necessary goals, interest, and knowledge that'll get us to less discriminatory, less biased outcomes for the organization, then in fact the goals and interests will be compromised, right? So I think it's I always often think about Kathy in this context because I think she was absolutely right. That identity is not enough. Your politics or what you're coming with, what you're bringing, what is the content and the substance of the fuller team that becomes so deeply important that we have to be reflective about and deeply reflective about.
Great. Thank you for that. So let's build on that. And one of the things I think was kind of talked about this morning, and the panelists I thought did a pretty good job of explaining it. But if you could dig a little deeper into eliminating that bias in the AI system that goes directly with what we're talking about, the diversity of the room, but having the right content to put in there, how do you see ways that can happen of eliminating that bias that's there?
Yeah, so there's a couple, and in fact there are, I'll speak to technological solutions that folk have come up with, and then I'll sort of speak a bit more broadly to a what I might characterize are solutions that are more broader to a techno-social system. So one is Raj from the panel, earlier panel mentioned a really important one, and that's that he characterized as debiasing data. And this is definitely a practice that is quite common and being taken up more and more. I think there's a couple of really important points to consider in this particular practice. So one, debiasing data becomes really limited to the training data, and it's much more complicated and almost I will almost use the word impossible when it comes to when an algorithm is live or its process of learning is automated. So debiasing data, when we have history of data that we're working with, that we're training an algorithm on, we can work on addressing that. But when an algorithm is actually live learning, when it's actually learning from actual data that it's processing in the moment, it's almost impossible to try to debias that data as that algorithm is processing it. Now, the other question too is what debiasing based on what? Based on what ethical norms? So in philosophy, there are over 26 different ethical perspectives, and all of those are not in agreement, we might say. Many of them are actually competing. And so the question becomes, in what context, under what circumstance do we use what particular ethical perspective? And how might that ethical perspective be competing with another ethical perspective? And I'll just give sort of a simple sort of example of how that can play out. If I'm an egalitarianist, or if I'm taking on an egalitarianist perspective, then I'm going to be trying to seek equality in outcomes, right? And so if I'm trying to seek gender equality, on particular outputs or outcomes, then in fact, the person who's taking on a lens or perspective of equity or a perspective of justice that's based on equity, then in fact, that actually in certain contexts will be in contradiction to or in tension with the equality perspective. Equity is not about providing equality. Equity is about providing what is needed in order to enable what is desired. So in some instances, that might mean inequality toward getting greater just ends. And so that those two perspectives are in fact often in tension with one another, despite the fact that they both come from a justice orientation. And so the question becomes, under what context, under what circumstances do we apply what ethical principles, and what are the ways in which they're competing with others, they're in tension with others, and how do we legitimate any particular ethical perspective in any particular context? Another one is what my colleagues Aaron Roth and Michael Kearns have developed, and I strongly recommend the audience to check out their book, The Ethical Algorithm. They've worked on developing what they call adjudicating algorithms that are where you have, on the one hand, we have our decision-making algorithm, and then we have this other algorithm that's an adjudicating algorithm. That adjudicating algorithm is trained based on social norms, some set of social norms. And the idea is for that adjudicating algorithm to sort of check the behavior of the decision-making algorithm. And whenever that decision-making algorithm begins to misbehave based on the social norms that adjudicating algorithm has been trained on, that adjudicating algorithm checks that decision-making algorithm. Now, this is a brilliant idea. It's, I think, one of the more sophisticated approaches of a technological solution to bias. At the same time, I think it also has limitations, as they also recognize. Social norms are not fixed, definite processes, things, but then, in fact, social norms are processes. They're situated. And so to deal with that, the situatedness, the process nature of social norms is really complicated in order to account for in that adjudicating algorithm. The other thing is also related to what I raised it with the previous example is, what are the ethical principles that we apply under what context and in what circumstances or conditions? And then the other one that I'll mention as a technological solution is, solution as I put in quotations for this one, is some of us are quite interested in how incompressible information with an algorithm, a machine learning algorithm that has an automated process of learning where the parameters are, in fact, more freed, if you will, might lead to transforming the logic of the algorithm in ways that, in fact, might be more equitable. So, for instance, when we have algorithms that are that have more definitions to them, more parameterizations of setting the boundaries of them, it then actually hegemonizes the logic of the algorithm and sets it to be fixed. And so what some of us are wondering about, and this is completely a speculative question at this point, is what are the ways in which uncompressible information, if an algorithm were less parameterized, that is to say, less defined in its boundaries, what's the potentiality that that algorithm under an open recursive system could potentially be open to being transformed by other logics, other ways of knowing and being. And then lastly, I'll mention that's not a more technological approach, but really has to do with the law and policy. You know, as I've mentioned, as I've often said in other contexts, the U.S. is like the wild, wild west when it comes to data and AI, and there's very little regulation. Prior to the pandemic, there was much more of a movement of pushing Congress, of pushing the law, and trying to address social, ethical, and political issues and concerns with data and AI. And there's a whole movement among technologists, academics, and even policymakers that's known as fairness, accountability, transparency, and ethics, FATE. They have a regular conference every year. If you're interested, I strongly encourage checking them out and learning about what they have going on, because much of this conversation is much of what they are taking up and trying to deal with. And it's made up of technologists, lawyers, policy folks, social scientists, and all. But I think it is deeply important that we come back to where we were prior to this pandemic, because unfortunately, what the pandemic has enabled are the conditions for technological companies and corporations to actually flourish even further. That is to say, all of the push that was actually occurring before has been relaxed, and now you have many digital companies that are in corporations that have been able to flourish even further and move even further along, both for better and for worse. I don't want to, and I hate to use that dichotomy, but without a question, the development is great. On the other hand, unregulated development is deeply concerning. We need to worry about unregulated development, particularly, especially for this audience, the ways in which it actually might have implications to discrimination and bias for minority business enterprises. So I'll stop there, but I'll this is part of this last point is to make a call that I really do think that this organization, the Carolinas, Virginia's Minority Supplier Development Council, should and could team up with other like organizations to really make sure to push this this policy agenda and make sure it's still getting the attention that it deserves and needs.
Thank you, Dr. Dixon-Roman. I actually have a question I'd like to address from Angus Kogallen. So I'm going to go ahead and unmute his line. Angus, are you available to ask your question live?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Yes, you can.
Great. So yeah, I thought it was really good information and great to sort of understand it a lot more. With it, my understanding is that you were saying it's really hard to get reliable data because they're being biased. They're being biased in, if the data is collecting information on what school people attended or their address. And even if you make the questions not biased, the data that is being collected and how it was collected could have been biased. And so it's a really tough challenge. My thought process is, from a business perspective, we always want to be able to increase diversity because it's good for society and it's also good for business. So is there an algorithm that's been developed that you would suggest to use that is proven to be better from both angles, less bias and proven to be good for business? And do you think that there will develop over time a central algorithm that companies globally could go to and measure where they are from a global footprint standpoint and compare themselves globally, and that would never be perfect from a bias point of view, but hopefully improve continuously?
Thank you. Great question. In fact, I'll say questions plural. Yes, that's precisely what I'm getting. What I'm arguing is that data is never fully reliable. And from a measurement perspective, complete reliability is always at the cost of validity. So there's always this trade-off of reliability and validity, which is, from the social science perspective, we're often worried about. From a data science perspective, that's less of a concern. The concern is about precision and prediction. I don't think these need to be in tension, but that's a whole nother conversation. To answer your question directly, I think it's important to keep in mind that we might think of sort of a curve when it comes to fairness and precision and the trade-off of fairness and precision. That's a nonlinear curve where the more precision the less fairness, and the more fairness, the less precision. And that the interest, at least, is to try to find that at least somewhat comfortable medium of a degree of precision and a degree of fairness that that is ethically appropriate and does not lead to the kind of social consequences on communities and people's lives. That said, so I do not think that there's a perfect algorithm, but I do think there are algorithmic practices that can lead to addressing some of these concerns and issues of bias and discrimination. So, for instance, the one example that I mentioned about Michael Kearns and Aaron Roth's work, they're part of what they're up to is to try to develop an adjudicating algorithm that, for instance, could be used with hiring practices, such that it does not lead to a hiring algorithm that would be misbehaving in its hiring practices. I also think that we need to think about, we need to take seriously that maybe the humans should not be completely taken out. That in fact some of the effective practices include developing ways of having algorithms that are engaging in interaction with a human adjudicator, and it uses the word adjudicator here. But for instance, we know this goes on with social media companies already. For instance, Twitter and Facebook, the way in which they are monitoring and even preventing offensive and even violent content from being presented on their platforms is by, on the one hand, having an algorithm that can actually go through and fastly read through and detect offensive and offensive or violent content, but then having a human, actual human adjudicator that is actually able to, once that content is flagged, they're actually then seeing it and making a review of it. I also think we might want to rely a bit more on community and other work and other human actors that can also point to certain instances where this algorithm may be misbehaving or this information may not be as accurate. And this is, this is another practice that goes on in the context of Facebook, as well as in the context of even Wikipedia as another example. But the other thing is, to the last part of your question, so Michael Kearns, myself, and Christopher Yu at the University of Pennsylvania are co-directors of a new initiative that is on data science and society. And part of the initiative is to develop a platform where companies and organizations could take whatever data they're using, upload it to this platform, and they would be able to see, based on a number of different charts and plots that are provided, the extent to which various different algorithms, whether it is a random forest, neural net, GAN, the generative adversarial network, regression, supervised logistic regression, clustering algorithm, any one of these algorithms, depending on the particular use and interest or context, that you upload your data and you'd be able to see these trade-off curves of fairness and precision, and be able to actually see the extent to which there would be bias within that data, and in what context or which algorithm would be better used in that context. And so there is in development, we're working actually in development on something that you precisely asked about, and I'm hopeful that we'll be able to get that publicly out and publicly used within the next year or so. So I ask that you stay tuned.
Thank you for that. Let's go to Shelby, if we could do Alexandria Sward's question, I think that would be a great opportunity for her to jump in right now.
Absolutely. So, Alexandra, I have now unmuted your line, so feel free to ask your question.
Hi, yeah, thanks for doing this. My question is, how should we approach benchmarking? So, for example, if I'm working on a supplier diversity program, should we compare our percent of diverse suppliers to the percent of diverse suppliers available nationally, locally, or do we assume that the local availability is artificially low and try and go higher than that?
Wow. Yeah, that's a great question. I have my social science question response to that, and I'm not so sure how well that would apply, honestly, to the business community on this. But let me give my social science response, and then I actually would like to maybe engage you on this, or even Jonathan or anyone else. So the way in which we would handle this in the social sciences is, so the question becomes, what's the population? What's the target population? And then from there, we'd develop our approach based on what representation is like within that target population, and actually, for instance, sample or even try to meet benchmark standards of representation from that target population. I'm not so sure how well that would apply in business, or even specifically in procurement here. But Jonathan, I don't know if you want to engage me on this one.
I'll jump in, Alexandra. Quick question for you. What industry would you consider yourself to be in?
Banking.
Banking. Okay. So perfect. Because the banking industry has a very robust supply diversity program. Capital One, Wells Fargo, all across the country. I have a lot of industry colleagues from those institutions, and they benchmark amongst themselves. So benchmarking is very difficult for you to do as an individual, because what is your actual nation of your measure for that benchmark? So if you have an industry standard to go off of, I think that will be the first layer that you will look at, and then you start to whittle down into the more specific areas that you want to look at. I wouldn't say based off of the local market and the availability of the suppliers in the market, would you be directly looking at it from, or the availability of suppliers being low due to systemic racism or other issues. It all depends on the market that you're in. Banking, I will tell you, I don't have a great grasp on the supply diversity world when it comes to banking. But I will tell you from a technology perspective, looking at Lenovo and the supplier base that we utilize, there oftentimes we have challenges in finding those suppliers that can handle the production side of things, whether it be from the scalability of that particular supplier, or they don't have the resources that we need. They're normally either just a wholesaler but are not a manufacturer. And going back to the scalability issue, I often make the analogy, it could be drinking from a fire hose if Lenovo was to go out and deal with, let's say, a packaging supplier, and we decided we were going to turn over all our business to a packaging supplier, and they're not ready. It could literally ruin their business and destroy them, for lack of a better term. So I really encourage you. I can, if you want to connect later, I can introduce you to some of the people from the industry, from your industry group. I'm pretty sure the banking has some benchmarking that takes place, and we can try to connect you with those individuals.
Thanks, Jonathan. That actually helps even for even drawing the parallel to from in some ways there's a way in which actually I think part of what I indicated with the social science perspective, actually sounds like there might be some parallels, in fact. But I appreciate hearing that response.
No problem. And question for you. So I want us to jump into the idea. So we've talked a lot about the things when it relates to biases when it comes to AI. What are some of the benefits? And I think that's important, right? We don't want to lose focus on what we can actually gain from the corporate perspective and also a minority of supplier perspective, but also suppliers in general gain from the utilization of AI inside corporations and procurement, or in the U.S. period.
Yeah, this is obviously not just an important question, but it's a deeply critical question. In fact, I would go as far as, sorry about this, alarm is going off. I'll keep on going and hopefully that'll go off soon. So I think it's really important to understand and recognize that if this is the direction that the world is moving, and the reality is, if you're not participating, you will be marginalized out. And so the question becomes, how are you going to jump in, or how are you going to find ways of employing AI in your own business practices? And what are the ways in which it will be necessary and effective for your business? And so that there are a number of different ways we might think about. For instance, it might be something as simple as, in order to promote your organization and what it's doing, developing algorithms that can literally crawl the net, that can crawl social media, and find ways of both learning what are the trends that seem to be going on, that seem to be materializing in social media, especially if you're focusing on news forms of social media, and how can we develop, have that algorithm provide alerts based on what's going on, and then on the flip side, how do we engage social media in order to potentially shape the discourse toward what our organization is about? How do we use social media in a way that can be both beneficial and drawing attention to what we do? The other thing is just quite simply, data science is deeply important for just providing further, deeper information about what is going on. What often is the case, and I can say this from having done a significant amount of consulting, statistical consulting, is there are many organizations that collect data, and that data winds up sitting, collecting dust, or is not being fully utilized to its greatest capacity. And so, what are the kinds of questions that you want to have that you're interested in asking? You might be asking your data for your organization. And what are the kinds of analytics that might help us to ask that data to get it there? And probably a more fundamental question, or more fundamental point is, are we collecting all the data that we can? Is there an infrastructure, a data infrastructure, in order to be housing and collecting all the data that's there and possible for us to even be taking advantage of? And so some of these are both infrastructural, but also the kind of analytics and processes that can provide further information for target populations or target market, how to better understand the behaviors in the market so that we're able to develop better forecasting and projections for our particular product. And also, what are I think some of this is even, what are the types of skill sets that are going to be needed, that our organization is going to need in order to be cutting edge, in order to really compete in the market of tomorrow, if you will. But I think, the broader, more important point that, Jonathan, that's in your question is, it's not all, what's the word? I don't want to say bad. It's not. This is not a write-off, if just because there's bias doesn't mean it renders us paralyzed. The question is, I think what's deeply important is that we understand what the algorithms and broader technosocial systems are doing, and how might we utilize them to make better use and enhance what we're doing in our own organizations. And sorry about the alarm. I hope you all were able to hear me. Sorry.
No problem. Thank you. We have one question from Jerry. Jerry's last name, missed his last name. But if you will unmute him and bring him live for us, Shelby, that would be wonderful.
Absolutely. So Jerry Knighton, you are now unmuted to ask your question.
I think your assessment is spot on in terms of the complexity of developing diverse teams and the balance between that and putting the right structure or algorithms in place to ensure that we control bias to the best as best we can. What advice? I know that I'm also at a higher education institution, and we are a state-supported institution, so there are lots of restrictions in terms of how we approach supply diversity. Do you have any suggestions in terms of how public institutions can approach this in a way that ensures that we are able to create opportunities for MBEs, but at the same time we're hamstrung to some degree by state laws and policies?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. And that latter part is a really complicated and difficult one, especially depending on what state you're in. Those state regulations and policies can also be quite restrictive and on the kind of sort of strategies and interventions that you might be trying to engage in order to enable greater diversity. But my almost just direct response to your question is lean on the networks. One of the factors that we know that helps to enable greater diversity in whether it's in hiring or in supply chains is in fact working those networks from underrepresented backgrounds that can then lead you to other potential persons or organizations. And while it may sound like nepotism, I think there's a way in which we can, there are ways in which you can engage those networks without falling into the kind of nepotistic kind of behaviors. And for instance, we know that there are certain communities and even organizations that are that tend to have be producing more persons or working with organizations that have greater diversity within them. And so maybe part of the process might be to in fact work those particular networks greater. So and I'll be a bit more sort of concrete here. HBCUs are a great example that where they're producing a number of graduates of color, and this has been their history, and diverse graduates for that matter. So rather than continuing to go the path of that often is the case of privileging particular institutions, then maybe we can potentially think of ways of developing pipelines or even develop relationships with historically Black universities as a way of really trying to tap into that supply chain, if you will, of potential employees. The other sort of example that comes to mind is really more preventative, and that's how implicit or unconscious bias can play out. And the reality is every last one of us are heirs to and victims is probably a strong way of putting it, but holders of various forms of bias. Even those of us of color are holders of bias that might be anti-Black, and we may not even be realizing it, or anti-Brown, and we may not even be realizing it. And so I think it's deeply important that we're honest about how we all are holders and heirs to bias, and to various degrees. And so being really thoughtful and meticulous about being reflexive in our practices. How can we put our own practices in check? How can we question constantly find ways of systematically questioning what we're doing in our various decision-making processes, so that we're trying to mitigate the potential for implicit or unconscious bias working into the process or system. Yeah, I think I'd love to hear if you have other thoughts that you're thinking about in your question as well.
In the Q&A that we've been engaged with CVMSDC in some efforts in terms of working with HBCUs. So I thought that was a excellent thought of how we can do a better job of engaging. Yeah, I mean it's really tough. One of the things that I'm involved in as well is that my office, we engage in dealing with complaints that individuals may have with regards to bias and, discrimination and things of that nature. And I think, the teams that work to make the decisions, it's so important that they understand, to your point, that we all have biases, but that we try our best to maintain a diverse, group of individuals who are on the front lines making decisions, and that we train those individuals appropriately, and that we have institutional goals that are well established to provide some guidance to those individuals to let them know how important diversity is in terms of supply diversity accomplishments. And so I think it's complicated, but it takes a lot of work to put in place a framework to make it successful and achieve the results, desired results that we want to achieve.
Yeah, actually, your point about making sure that everyone is on board and understands the value of diversity in any organization is a really good one, because I think it still is the case that that's not completely there's not complete consensus and agreement on that. I think we should not begin with that as a given. I think we should begin with that as a necessary point to make sure everyone is on board with. And in fact, it needs to be grounded in the empirical research literature on it. And there's a ton of research literature that indicates the value of diversity. But I do think it still is the case, and not everyone agrees with that. And so beginning there is a really important initial place. I will say, this may be me being optimistic, but I'm hopeful that the current moment, the current global condition, the current global uprising is going to provide some conditions to be helpful in shifting that discourse and shifting that understanding. But hands down, if leaning on and grounding it in the research literature on this can only help, because as we know that how data and research has a way of actually pushing and shifting understanding. So thank you. I appreciate this the question and even what you additionally just added.
Dr. Dixon-Roman, thank you so much for great enlightening aspects about bias and across many different ways, not only in procurement, but in, like you said, psychometrics, in many different ways. And we're grateful for that. And I think it eliminates just a lot of points that in procurement don't often think about, but as human beings, we need to be sensitive to that and aware. Thanks again. With that, I'm going to pass the baton on to our CVMSDC leaders here. If you have comments and praise and even constructive criticism, feel free to put that in, send that off to our CVMSDC MSDC folks. And of course, if you have praise and accolades, please feel free to use social media and the hashtags we provided at the beginning of the conference.
And to piggyback on what Dupree just said, and thank you guys, thank you, Dr. Dixon-Roman, for participating. Your discussion was awesome. It was very enlightening as to the intentionality that supply chains have to be focused on moving forward as it relates to AI and the biases that could be created. So greatly appreciate it for your commentary and your participation today, and even going to the last comment about the state of the world that we currently live in. And you know, I'm thankful and I'm hopeful. My uncles often tell me, since all of this has started, that this is a movement that they haven't seen since the early civil rights movements in the 50s and 60s. So they're very encouraged about what can happen. And even from a corporate perspective, I'm seeing corporations across the country step up and not just put their dollars behind what's going on, but their internal structuring behind what is happening. And Lenovo is, I'm proud to say we are a part of that movement as well. So again, thank you for being in participation today.
On behalf of NMSDC and our 23 affiliate councils, I want to take a moment to respond to the current events regarding continued racial injustices and the responses unfolding around our nation. This is a painful time for our country and a reminder of the principles of which NMSDC was founded. We are struggling to understand the senseless deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and too many others before whose lives have been taken as a result of racial injustice. We need change across America, and our commitment to you is that we will be solution-oriented as we advocate for economic inclusion domestically and globally. We will listen to our MBEs to understand their challenges and work together to effect real change. The time is now to be intentional about minority business inclusion. Minority businesses are the foundation of communities crying out today. They are the leaders, job creators, and the voice for those who continue to be unheard. As Pope Paul VI stated, if you want peace, work for justice. Let's be intentional about the change we want to see. Let's work together to address systemic racial barriers and advance minority business inclusion. Join us as we launch our In This Together campaign. Here's how you can help us. Number 1. Minority businesses have already been financially distressed at a higher rate than any other business group due to COVID-19. The recent unrest in urban cities across the country has impacted these businesses even more, as some were vandalized as a result of the protests and riots. Many businesses made investments in their communities, and now it's time we make investments in them. We are starting a rebuilding fund to provide assistance to those in need. Visit our website at nmsdc.org for more information. Number 2. We will focus on addressing issues of capital for MBEs. You can support funding efforts for the Business Consortium Fund, which we just announced this week has begun providing PPP loans. We've also convened the Minority Wealth Commission, being led by Henry Childs, who joined forces with NMSDC after leaving the U.S. Department of Commerce as the National Director for the Minority Business Development Agency. And we're introducing MBE Pay, a tool that will allow our MBEs to access cash faster through a payment portal. More information will be coming soon on this initiative, but click the links to find out information about the others that I mentioned. Number 3, we implemented the NMSDC Academy to focus on innovative programming needs in collaboration with the Minority Business Enterprise Input Committee and our affiliate councils. We are asking for your investment in these programs that will help build scale and capacity for your sourcing needs. And number 4, lastly, we are asking for your public commitment to minority business inclusion. We are asking our corporate partners to sign the pledge that they will invest in at least one of these initiatives to support minority business development and economic parity. We will highlight those early adopters at our virtual awards gala on June 11th. It's time for intentional efforts, and your actions matter. We will use our platform to identify ways to address systemic barriers peacefully and in collaboration with our partners. The mission of NMSDC was designed specifically for times such as these. Our mission is unwavering, connecting minority businesses with access to capital, access to opportunities, and the corporate supply chain does indeed make a difference in our communities. The business case is still as relevant today as it was nearly 50 years ago, and we are asking you to reaffirm your commitment to advance our mission. Again, the ask is, number 1, donate to the rebuilding efforts. 2, invest in access to capital initiatives. 3, sponsor key and innovative programming. 4, sign the pledge. We are in this together. Be well, stay safe, and we will come through these challenging times even stronger because we are NMSDC. And remember, minority business matters.
Hello, Andrea. Thank you so much for joining back. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Wow, we are done. Hello, Dupree. Thank you all so much for joining us today. What a wealth of information across industries. I can't thank SAS and Andrea enough for assembling this team together to share this information. A special thank you to our keynote, Dr. Ezekiel Roman-Dixon, and to Jonathan for moderating. Dupree, thank you for moderating. We had a wealth of knowledge, a wealth of information. And as a follow-up, we're going to be sending out a packet of information to our attendees, which includes the full-blown presentation. There's an actual video presentation from Ezekiel that we want to share with each of you. We thought it was more appropriate for us to have dialogue today versus you just watching his video. But we will send that to you for your review. And if there are any questions on how to get started with the process, we are here as a resource for you. Again, thank you to our volunteer board. Thank you to our sponsors. And with that, I will turn it over to our host sponsor, Andrea. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dominique. This was absolutely fantastic. I am thrilled with all of the discussions that were had, all the questions that were posed. I think we all came back with some really good knowledge and information to take back to our corporations or to use as a smaller, diverse business. In addition to the video that's going to be shared after, there's also a couple of PowerPoint presentations and white papers that will just kind of round out this event even more. So with that, thank you to everyone. Thank you to all the attendees. And this concludes Proforum 2020.
Thank you so much. Congratulations.